The world remembers kings, conquerors, and empires, but heaven remembers men and women who walked by faith. After the apostles of the Lamb, God never stopped raising witnesses. They preached when it was illegal. They believed when it was dangerous. They endured when it cost them everything. This is heroes of faith, the true stories of believers whose lives proved that God is real. His power is timeless, and faith still changes the world. Kindly like, share, and subscribe, and let their faith strengthen you.
The waves were swallowing the ship whole. Somewhere in the black heart of the Indian Ocean, in a year when most men in Europe had never seen the sea, a small wooden vessel was being torn apart by a storm so violent that seasoned sailors were weeping openly, clinging to ropes, convinced they were breathing their last. Passengers had stopped praying and started screaming. Merchandise that represented entire family fortunes was being thrown overboard. The masts groaned like dying men. And then, in the middle of all of it, one man walked calmly to the edge of the ship, knelt down, and lowered a small wooden crucifix into the raging water. The storm stopped. Not gradually. Not slowly. The storm simply stopped, as though heaven itself had reached down and placed a hand over the mouth of the sea. The sailors stood in stunned silence. The merchants stopped breathing. And the man who had done it quietly rose, dried his crucifix, and went back to check on the sick passengers he had been nursing for the past several hours. He did not celebrate. He did not explain himself. He simply went back to work. That man was Francis Xavier. And what you are about to hear is the story of a human being so completely surrendered to God that the boundary between the natural and supernatural seemed, in his life, to almost disappear entirely. This is the story of a man who crossed 20,000 miles of ocean and jungle and desert, who was shot with arrows, beaten with stones, stalked by assassins, betrayed by allies, abandoned on a dying island, and who, through all of it, never once turned back. This is the story of a man who baptized over 700,000 souls with his own hands. A man who raised the dead. A man who held back armies with a single sentence. A man whom even the pagans called the God of the world. But before all of that, he was just a proud Spanish nobleman who cared more about his academic reputation than anything else in the world, and a fisherman from Loyola was about to ruin everything he had planned for his life. The year was approximately 1506, and in the ancient castle of Xavier in the kingdom of Navarre, in what we now call Spain, a woman named Donna Maria gave birth to her last child. The castle itself sat on the edge of a kingdom that was already trembling, for the political world of Navarre was shifting dangerously, caught between the ambitions of France and Spain. Francis was born into nobility, into the last breath of a proud lineage, the youngest of several children, and from the beginning his family recognized something distinct in him. While his brothers followed the military path natural to men of their class, young Francis burned with a different fire. He wanted to know things. He wanted to master ideas, to win arguments, to be recognized for the quality of his mind. And so his family sent him to Paris, to the University of Paris, the greatest center of learning in the known world at that time. The 1520s. A world being cracked open by the Protestant Reformation, by new sea routes, by the slow death of a medieval order and the painful birth of something new. Francis Xavier arrived in this churning world and enrolled in the College of St. Barbara, and he was brilliant. He completed his philosophy, received the degree of master, and immediately began to teach, earning applause from his peers, building exactly the kind of reputation he had always wanted. He was young, gifted, handsome, full of what the record calls a somewhat haughty spirit, a natural pride that came easily to a man of noble birth who was also genuinely talented. He was going to be someone important. He had planned for it. He could already feel the weight of the future honors settling around his shoulders. And then a man named Ignatius of Loyola moved into his dormitory. Ignatius was not what Xavier expected. He was older, and he had the kind of strange authority that comes from a man who has already been broken and rebuilt by something larger than himself. He had been a soldier, he had been wounded, he had encountered God in a way that had turned his entire world inside out, and now he moved through the University of Paris like a man on a mission, quietly, patiently, looking for souls he could set on fire. He had already won Peter Faber, a humble and deeply devout young man who shared rooms with Xavier. And now Ignatius turned his full attention to the brilliant, proud Spaniard who wanted nothing to do with him. The early attempts went nowhere. Xavier looked at Ignatius with the contempt that talented young men often reserve for people whose ambitions seem too spiritual to be serious. He saw Ignatius's humility as weakness, his poverty as lack of ambition. But Ignatius was not foolish. He did not argue. He did not lecture. Instead, he began to help Xavier. He praised his lectures publicly. He found him new students. He attended his classes with evident respect. He made himself indispensable to the very career Xavier was building. And when he had finally broken through the wall of pride, when Francis had come to see that this former soldier was not a fool but a man of extraordinary depth, Ignatius asked him one question. Just one. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Xavier would later say that this question was like a sword entering him. He repeated it to others for the rest of his life. He used it in conversions across 3 continents. He said that if he could reach the heart of a king, he would carve those words there. Something about it unlocked a door in him that had been quietly sealed for years, and through that door came a torrent of desire, not for reputation anymore, not for academic glory, but for God. For total surrender. For something worth dying for. In 1534, on the 15th of August, the feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Francis Xavier gathered with Ignatius, Peter Faber, and 4 other companions at a small chapel at Montmartre outside Paris. Peter Faber, the only priest among them, celebrated Massachusetts. And at the moment of communion, one by one, they made vows. Vows of poverty. Vows of chastity. A vow to journey to the Holy Land and serve the conversion of souls. And if the Holy Land proved impossible, a vow to place themselves entirely at the disposal of the Pope, to be sent wherever the Church needed them most. Francis Xavier was 30 years old, more or less, and he had just signed his life away to God. What followed next was years of additional study, journeys on foot through snow-covered mountains in Germany, encounters with armed heretics, physical sufferings offered up without complaint. There is a story from these years that tells you almost everything you need to know about who Francis Xavier was becoming. On one of these journeys across Europe, determined to mortify the pride he had once taken in his graceful bearing, Xavier bound his arms and legs tightly with small cords, knotting them at intervals. He did this and kept walking, day after day. The cords cut through skin, sank into flesh, caused inflammation, then infection. He concealed his agony completely, keeping pace with his companions, saying nothing, until his legs swelled so severely he could no longer stand. When his companions finally discovered what he had done, they carried him to the nearest village and sent for a surgeon, who took one look at the situation and refused to operate, saying he could not cut the cords away without severing nerves, and that if he tried, Xavier would certainly die. So they left him. They made him as comfortable as they could and they left him, because there was nothing else to do. That night, alone in a rough bed in a foreign village, Francis prayed. And in the morning, the cords were found broken into small pieces scattered across the bed. The flesh that had been swollen, infected, ravaged, was healed. No scars remained. The surgeon found him that same morning, risen, healthy, ready to continue the journey. It was not the last time God would do something like that for Francis Xavier. It was only the beginning. The Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, was formally approved by Pope Paul III in 1540. And even before the ink was dry on that approval, a request had arrived in Rome from the King of Portugal, John III, begging for missionaries to go to the Indies. The Portuguese were building an empire in Asia, and the king was devout enough to understand that commerce without the gospel was hollow. He wanted priests. Real ones. Ignatius chose Simon Rodriguez and a man named Bobadilla for the mission. Francis Xavier was not chosen. And perhaps this is one of the most extraordinary turns in this extraordinary story, because it means that Francis Xavier's entire life of apostolic conquest, all of those 700,000 baptisms, all of those kingdoms, all of those dead men raised, all of those storms stilled, was never the original plan. It was a substitution. A last-minute change. Bobadilla fell ill the night before the ambassador was supposed to leave Rome, so ill that his recovery seemed doubtful. Ignatius lay in his own sickbed that night, wrestling with the decision. And in the morning he called Francis Xavier to his side. He told him the circumstances. He said that by counsels higher than human judgment, Xavier had been chosen for the mission to the Indies. That the Pope himself was sending him. That God, from the East, was calling. Xavier's response was immediate and total. He was given 1 day's notice. He mended his worn-out habit, received the blessing of Pope Paul III, embraced his brothers, and left Rome on the 16th of March, 1540, carrying nothing of significance except himself, a breviary, and a burning heart. The Pope's blessing that day was pointed and prophetic. He told Xavier to rely entirely on God, not on his own powers. He told him he was going to dangerous places and must be prepared for a life that would resemble, in some ways, a continual dying. He told him that no death could be more fitting for an apostle than martyrdom. Xavier listened, the record says, as if our Lord himself was speaking. He answered in terms that blended such humility with such intrepid courage that the old pontiff was both edified and astonished. And then Francis Xavier walked out of Rome into the rest of the world. The journey to Lisbon took more than 3 months. It passed through Bologna, through the Pyrenees, dangerously close to the castle where Francis had been born, where his aged mother still lived. The Portuguese ambassador, Don Peter Mascarenhas, expected that Xavier would ask to stop, to take even a brief farewell of his family. He had been separated from them for many years, and this departure was all but certainly permanent. He would likely never see his mother again. Xavier said nothing. He did not ask to stop. He did not even glance toward the castle. When the ambassador himself pointed out how close they were and urged him to go, even just for courtesy's sake, Xavier answered quietly that he preferred to defer seeing his friends until he could meet them in heaven, where the meeting would be eternal rather than transient. This is the kind of man God was working with. In Lisbon, the king and queen received him with the warmth due a saint, and he spent almost a year there, preaching, hearing confessions, reforming the court, working with the young princes. The people of Lisbon called him an apostle. The king, who could hardly bear to lose him, nearly prevented the mission entirely, but a letter from Ignatius convinced him to let Xavier go to India and keep Rodriguez in Portugal. On the 7th of April, 1541, his own 35th birthday, Francis Xavier boarded a ship called the St. James and sailed for the Indies. The voyage alone was 13 months, and what he did during those 13 months is itself a sermon. The ship carried nearly 1,000 people. Within weeks of departure, disease broke out. The calms off the coast of Guinea cooked the passengers alive. The fresh water turned foul and dark with things no one wanted to examine. Men lay dying in every direction, and there was not enough crew left healthy to attend to them all. Xavier became their doctor, their nurse, their priest, and their servant simultaneously. He dressed wounds. He washed the bodies of the dying. He cooked food for those too weak to feed themselves. He dug graves for those who did not survive. He gave his cabin to the sickest passengers and slept on the open deck with coiled ropes for a pillow. When the ship's governor offered him a place at his table, Xavier took the food and distributed it among the sick, himself surviving on begged crusts of bread. He was sick himself for 2 months during the worst of it, racked with nausea and weakened by the heat. He attended the sick anyway. They wintered at Mozambique, where the climate killed Europeans so reliably that sailors called the place the tomb of the continent. 80 people from the fleet died during those 6 months. The situation in the hospital was catastrophic. Xavier threw himself into it with such total abandon that he himself contracted a violent fever, was bled 7 times in a matter of days, and for 3 consecutive days lost his mind entirely to delirium. Yet witnesses recorded that whenever anyone spoke to him of God during those delirious days, or when he himself began to speak of God, his mind cleared instantly, completely, as though the fever had no power over the part of him that belonged to heaven. When he recovered, he sailed on. He arrived in Goa on the 6th of May, 1542. Goa was supposed to be a Christian city. It was the capital of Portugal's Eastern Empire, the seat of the archbishop, the center of ecclesiastical authority in Asia. What Xavier found there stunned him into action so immediate that within 4 months the city had been visibly transformed. The Portuguese settlers had adopted the vices of Asia with remarkable thoroughness while largely abandoning the faith of Europe. Fewer people went to confession once a year than in almost any city he had ever seen. Licentiousness was open and unashamed. The local population was being exploited, enslaved, and scandalized rather than evangelized. Xavier began his mornings at the hospital for lepers in the suburbs, moving from bed to bed, consoling each patient personally, begging alms from the Portuguese to support them, collecting them all afterward for mass and instruction. From there he walked to the city and preached to the Portuguese. In the afternoons he visited the prisons. In the evenings he walked through the streets ringing a small bell, crying out to the people to send their children and servants to him for instruction. He would then lead 200 or 300 children to the nearest church and teach them the Creed, the Commandments, the Our Father, the Hail Mary, everything necessary for the soul. He did this every single day. And in the mornings before all of that, he was on his knees before God for hours, feeding the engine that drove everything else. Within months, people who had not been to confession in years were standing in lines. The confession lines grew so long that Xavier wrote to Rome saying that even if he could multiply himself tenfold and be in 10 places at once, he could not satisfy everyone who was asking. Men were severing unlawful relationships. Stolen property was being returned. Ancient grudges were being released. The pagans who lived nearby looked at what was happening to this supposedly Christian city and called the change miraculous. But Goa was only the beginning of the beginning. The Paravans were a fishing people on the pearl fishery coast at the southern tip of India, and they had been baptized 10 years earlier, 20,000 of them at once, more as a political maneuver to gain Portuguese protection from Saracen persecution than as a genuine act of faith. For 10 years they had lived as Christians in name only, with no priest who spoke their language, no instruction, no sacraments, nothing. They were Christian in the same way a building is Christian because a cross was placed on its roof. Xavier heard about them, and the vicar general proposed him for the mission. He accepted before the man had finished the sentence. He arrived at the fishery with 2 young Indian deacons as interpreters, and he immediately understood the scale of what he was facing. He could not speak their language. They could not speak his. He had no resources, no infrastructure, no precedent. He sat down with a few educated men from among the community, those who knew some Portuguese, and together they worked for days, translating the Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the Commandments, the Hail Mary, the Confiteor, the Salve Regina, all of it, into the Malabar tongue. Then Xavier committed it all to memory. And he walked out into the villages. He rang his bell. He gathered the people. He sang the prayers out loud. He taught them to sing back. He was there for a month in each village, drilling, teaching, organizing, appointing the most able among them to continue after he left. He baptized so many people in a single day that his voice gave out and his arm went numb from making the sign of the cross. He wrote later to Ignatius that on one day alone he had baptized the entire population of a large and populous parish. Of children alone who died shortly after baptism and went immediately to God, he counted more than 1,000. The children of the fishery became his most faithful companions in the work. They followed him everywhere. They chased down their parents when those parents slipped back into idol worship. They gathered up the stone and clay idols and dragged them to Xavier's feet, kicking them, smashing them, throwing the pieces into the sea. They would find adult Christians secretly venerating a pagan idol and report it to the Holy Father with the relentless zeal of the newly converted. Xavier would arrive with his troop of fervent children and collect every idol in the house. Miracles began to accumulate like water behind a dam. A pagan woman had been in labor for 3 days, dying. Her family had tried everything. Xavier came, explained the faith to her as she labored, asked her if she believed, asked her if she would be baptized. She said yes. He read a gospel over her and baptized her. She was immediately delivered and cured. An entire family received baptism in their wonder and gratitude. The report spread. Others came. Then, deeper into his time on the coast, something happened that the church would later examine in extraordinary legal detail during his canonization processes. A young boy named Anthony Miranda was sleeping in a hut with his companion Augustine when a hooded serpent, one of the most venomous in India, bit him while he slept. In the morning, Augustine woke and found his companion cold and unresponsive. He found the serpent beneath the sleeping mat. He ran screaming to Xavier. Xavier walked calmly to the hut, knelt beside the dead boy, fixed his eyes on heaven, touched the swollen foot with spittle, made the sign of the cross, and said, simply, "In the name of Jesus Christ, arise." Anthony stood up. Alive. Healthy. They all resumed their journey that same morning. There were 3 confirmed resurrections from the dead on the Pearl Fishery coast alone. A drowned boy. A dead boy in a church. A third whose circumstances are recorded in the canonization documents, though the details are sparse. Later, in the kingdom of Travancore, there would be 4 more. In Covalin, where the majority of the population refused to convert, Xavier changed his approach entirely. He stopped preaching and started praying. And while he was on his knees before God, he said aloud to the crowd, "If you will not believe God speaking through my mouth, let us see whether anything will convince you. What proof do you want?" Then he remembered that a man had been buried there the previous day. He asked them to open the grave. They did. The body was already beginning to putrefy. Every person present confirmed it. Xavier knelt. He prayed briefly. He stood and looked at the dead man and said, "I command you in the holy name of God and in testimony of the truth of the faith I teach, arise and live." The man woke up. Not slowly. He woke up the way a person wakes from a gentle sleep, and he stood, alive and healthy, before a crowd of witnesses who unanimously said the same thing in one voice: "Great is the God of the Christians, and true is the law that the Great Father teaches." The entire village asked for baptism. The neighboring villages heard and came. The kingdom of Travancore was, within a matter of months, entirely Christian. But it was not a peaceful victory. Nothing in Xavier's life was ever peaceful. The Betajas were a ferocious group of raiders from the kingdom of Bisnagar, idol worshippers who hated Christians and who saw the newly converted Paravans as a target worth destroying. They attacked with a large force, driving the Paravans from their homes onto rocky islands in the sea where there was no food and no fresh water, and people began dying of thirst and exposure under the sun. Xavier organized relief boats loaded with food and water and sailed to them himself. He wept with them over their losses. He wrote letters organizing further aid. But the Betajas were not finished. They returned the following year with an army, this time aimed at the newly Christian kingdom of Travancore. The king assembled his forces and marched to meet them. By every military calculation, the Betajas should have won. Their numbers were overwhelming. Their reputation for violence was absolute. Xavier went to the front. He prostrated himself on the ground and prayed. He reminded God of his promises to defend those who belonged to him. He told God that these new Christians were exposed to this risk precisely because they had chosen to belong to God, and asked that their enemies not be allowed to boast of victory over heaven's own protected ones. Then he rose and walked straight toward the advancing Betage army. He stood in the valley in front of thousands of armed men, and in a voice that multiple witnesses described as thunderous, he said, "In the name of the living God, I command you to return from where you came." The army stopped. The front ranks could not move. The rear ranks pushed forward and were told it was impossible, that something was blocking them, that there was an unknown man in black in front of the army whose aspect was not human, whose stature seemed gigantic, whose flashing face dazzled their eyes. The captains rode forward to see for themselves. They saw what their men had described. And then, as if driven by some force none of them could name or resist, the entire army turned and fled back to Bisnagar. Xavier's companion stood behind him and watched, and then went running back to find the king. The king stepped out to meet Xavier, embraced him, and said, "I am called the Great King, and henceforth you shall be called the Great Father." The king never converted. That grief stayed with Xavier. But the entire surrounding population did, and the kingdom remained Christian. There were years of this. Years of walking, sailing, baptizing, healing, preaching, suffering. The Moluccas, where he climbed mountains on his hands and knees to reach Christians hiding in caves from Saracen persecution. Amboina, where he nursed dying sailors from disease-struck fleets, personally digging graves for those who did not survive. Ternate, where his reform was so complete that he said he left only 2 people on the island in a state of mortal sin. The island of Moro, which every Portuguese friend, every companion, every well-meaning advisor begged him not to visit. The island of Moro was considered a death sentence. The people were cannibals. They were known for poison. They had already killed a Portuguese priest. The governor of Ternate actually issued a formal prohibition on anyone sailing Xavier to that island. When Xavier heard about the prohibition, he went to the pulpit and preached with such fire about the perishing souls on Moro that several of the same people who had tried to stop him volunteered to go with him. He went. And the island of Moro, which everyone called impossible, became Christian. In his letters from this period, he wrote words that should be branded onto the heart of every person who has ever called a mission field too dangerous to enter. He wrote that there is nothing to fear but his own fear. That God commanded him to go there, and that men should never deter anyone from obeying that command. He wrote that there were no torments, no death, for which he was not prepared, that if he was massacred his blood would be more powerful than his voice for the salvation of those people. He wrote that in the early church the gospel owed more to the blood of martyrs than to the sweat of preachers. And then there was Japan. It began with a young Japanese nobleman named Xavier, a man of sharp intellect and deep spiritual restlessness who had killed someone and fled to a Portuguese merchant ship for safety, heard about a man called Francis Xavier in Malacca, and decided, across 2,500 miles of dangerous ocean, to go find him. Xavier arrived in Malacca just as Xavier had left for the Moluccas. He tried to return to Japan and was driven back by storms that seemed almost deliberate. He returned to Malacca and found Xavier had come back. The meeting, by Xavier's own later account, produced a sensation in his soul that he described as preternatural. He converted, was baptized, received the name Paul of the Holy Faith, and spent months burning with the desire to see his homeland in the light of the gospel. From the moment Xavier heard Xavier's descriptions of Japan, a fire was lit in him that nothing would extinguish. The people who loved truth, who would only accept what reason confirmed, who studied, discussed, examined every idea with ferocious intellectual precision, who had monks who lived in contemplation and preached in public, who had, in their monasteries, something almost like spiritual exercises, who were, for all the density of their error, capable of recognizing truth when they saw it. He wrote to the fathers in Goa to prepare. He prayed for months over the decision, entreating the guardian angels of Japan to help him discern God's will. He received the conviction, quiet and total, that God wanted him there. The voyage itself was a remarkable illustration of how God uses even the worst instruments for his purposes. The only ship available to sail directly to Japan was captained by a Chinese pirate, a sorcerer, a man so notorious for robbery that his vessel had been nicknamed the robber's junk. Xavier's friends were appalled. He boarded it. On the feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, the 15th of August, 1549, the robber's junk dropped anchor at Kagoshima, the hometown of Paul of the Holy Faith, on the island of Japan. Japan in 1549 was everything Xavier had been told and more. It was also everything he had not been fully prepared for. The bonzes, the Buddhist and Shinto monks and priests who formed the intellectual and religious establishment of Japanese society, were powerful, corrupt, and terrified. They recognized immediately what the European bonzes represented, and they fought back with every tool available to them. Slander, political manipulation, threats of divine vengeance, incitement of mobs. On 2 separate occasions, Xavier was only kept alive by what can only be called miraculous intervention, storms of thunder and lightning that broke up the ambushes waiting for him at the city gates. He spent his first months in Japan simply learning. This was the humility of a true apostle, not arriving with all the answers, but sitting down to understand. He studied the language. He observed the culture. He spent 40 days in committed language study before God, in what the witnesses described as a sudden infusion, gave him the complete language, its grammar, its vocabulary, its pronunciation instantaneously. The gift of tongues was documented so extensively in his life that the bull of his canonization specifically addresses it. He spoke in one language and was simultaneously understood by people of many different nations, each in their own tongue. This happened repeatedly, publicly, before crowds of witnesses, in ways that even the hostile bonzes could not explain away, and which they privately admitted was beyond natural capacity. In Kagoshima, in Ferrando, in Amenguki, conversions accumulated. In Amenguki alone, 3,000 people became Christians. The bonzes mounted their most sophisticated intellectual challenge in the court of the king of Bungo, where the most celebrated theologian in the region, a man called Fukurandono, came with 6 of his best disciples to destroy Xavier in open debate before the assembled nobility. Fukurandono's opening gambit was subtle. He claimed to have known Xavier from a previous existence 1,500 years earlier, when they had done business together. This was the doctrine of metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls, presented with theatrical authority. Xavier recognized it immediately, identified it for what it was, and dismantled it with such logical precision that the bonze was unable to respond. He was humiliated, disgraced, expelled from the court by the king himself. He came back the next day with 6 of his ablest colleagues. The debate continued for 3 sessions. In each session the bonzes were overcome. Not by rhetoric, not by shouting, but by truth, calmly and methodically presented by a man who had spent years on his knees before the God whose existence he was defending. The king of Bungo never converted during Xavier's lifetime. But 27 years later, in 1578, he publicly declared himself a Christian, was baptized with the name Francis, tore his most treasured idol out of his private cabinet and had it dragged through the streets and thrown into the sea, and spent the remaining 9 years of his life fasting, praying, giving the sacraments every second day, building churches, protecting the persecuted Christians of his kingdom, and weeping with joy whenever he heard that the gospel was spreading to new provinces. Xavier left Japan in November of 1551, his heart already turned toward China. He had come to understand, through his time in Japan, that the Japanese followed China in religious matters, and that if China could be reached, Japan would follow. He had already translated a catechism into Chinese. He already had the beginning of a plan. He returned to Goa, reorganized the missions, appointed Gaspar Barzus as vice-provincial, knelt at the man's feet as the first act of deference toward the new authority, distributed his companions to their various missions, and began assembling what would become his last and greatest apostolic enterprise, the attempted entry into the most closed and guarded empire on earth. There was a magnificent twist of providence waiting in the details. James Pereira, one of Xavier's most faithful friends, was a merchant of both wealth and genuine piety, and he offered to fund an entire Portuguese embassy to the Chinese emperor, absorbing all costs personally, if Xavier would lead it. The plan was approved by the viceroy. The King of Portugal was informed. Letters were prepared in gold. Gifts of extraordinary value were assembled. Papal briefs existed, designating Xavier as apostolic nuncio, giving him more formal authority than he had used in 10 years. And then a man named Don Alvaro Atade, the newly appointed governor of Malacca, decided that his own financial interests were more important than the spread of the gospel. Atade seized Pereira's ship. He confiscated its rudders so it could not sail. He laughed at the papal briefs. He ridiculed Xavier to his associates, called him a hypocrite, called the whole Chinese enterprise an excuse for a merchant to get rich. Xavier used every peaceful means available to him. He had theologians speak to Atade. He had the vicar read him the sentence of excommunication. He prayed for the man every morning. He wept before God over his soul. It made no difference. The embassy died in the harbor of Malacca. In his letter to Pereira, one of the last things he ever wrote, Xavier said that the enormity of his own sins was likely the reason God would not accept his services in China. He asked Pereira not to come to see him at his departure, because the sight of his grief would be too much to bear. He walked to the small chapel on the shore, removed his shoes, shook them against a stone so that not a particle of Malacca's soil would leave with him, and boarded the ship. He had prophesied, quietly, to several people, that within a year the majority of those present would be dead. That he himself would never return to Goa alive. that Don Alvaro Atade would be stripped of everything before he died. Every word was fulfilled. Xavier arrived at Sanchin, a small cluster of islands off the Chinese coast where Portuguese merchants were permitted to trade without entering the mainland, in August of 1552. All around him the mainland of China lay tantalizingly close, a few miles of water away, and completely forbidden to foreigners under penalty of death. He began making arrangements. He found an interpreter. He found a Chinese merchant willing to smuggle him ashore at night. He secured the merchant's agreement with an oath of silence about who had brought him. And then he fell ill. The fever came on a Sunday. He was carried first to a ship, then, because the motion of the vessel disturbed his prayer, was carried ashore to a small hut of branches and straw owned by a Portuguese named Jorge Alvarez. The ships gradually left for the season. His companions dwindled. The merchant who had agreed to smuggle him into China disappeared and never returned. The interpreter backed out. The young men who were supposed to sail with him had no boat. And then the Portuguese on the island, consumed by fear of Chinese retribution, began to openly leave. His last host departed secretly in the night without telling Xavier, slipping away while the holy man was at Mass so as not to face him. Xavier emerged from the altar, looked around at the thinning crowd, and with prophetic certainty said, "Do you see where that man's sins are leading him? He does not know what awaits him in Malacca." The man reached Malacca and was murdered by robbers within days of his arrival. On the island of Sanchin, Francis Xavier was alone. Nearly alone. He had young Anthony, the Chinese boy from Goa, and one or two others who remained out of loyalty rather than obligation. He had almost nothing to eat. Anthony had to beg bread for him from sailors who were barely willing to spare it. He lay in a hut of branches with the wind blowing through the walls, looking across a strip of water at a continent he had given everything to reach, a continent whose hundreds of millions of souls would have to wait for other men in other generations, because God had decided that Francis Xavier's race was run. He received the last sacraments with full clarity of mind. He fixed his eyes on the crucifix in his hands. Those present heard him calling on the Holy Trinity, calling on Jesus the Son of David, asking Mary to show herself a mother. On the 2nd of December, 1552, at approximately 2 hours after midday, he fixed his gaze on the crucifix one last time and said, "In thee, O Lord, have I hoped, I shall not be confounded forever." And he died. He was 46 years old. He was buried hastily, almost without ceremony, by 4 people, in a field near a cross he had planted. Quicklime was poured over the body to consume the flesh so the bones could eventually be transported to Malacca. Here is where things became remarkable again. Remarkable in a way that even those who had neglected him in his dying could not explain away. When the grave was opened 2.5 months later, the body was perfect. Perfectly preserved. Flexible. Its natural color was unchanged, so fresh and lifelike that when they cut into the thigh to take a piece of flesh as a relic, bright blood flowed as though he had just died minutes before. The lime that should have consumed the flesh had done nothing. Even the vestments were undamaged. The sailors carried the body to Malacca, where it arrived to extraordinary scenes of repentance and veneration. A pestilence that had been killing the city for weeks stopped the moment the body arrived. A famine eased when several ships laden with provisions entered the harbor the same day. Healings began immediately and did not stop. When the body was eventually brought to Goa on the 15th of March, 1554, the reception was one of the most remarkable scenes in the history of Asian Christianity. Every ship in the harbor saluted it with artillery. The nobility, the clergy, the magistracy, and thousands of ordinary people waded into the water to meet the approaching boat. People who were too sick to walk were carried to the beach, and some of them were healed simply by being present when the body passed. A woman who had not been able to walk was cured. A child who was receiving last rites sat up, healthy, as the procession passed her door. Francis Xavier was buried in the Church of St. Paul in Goa, where his incorrupt body remains to this day. He was beatified in 1619 and canonized in 1622, alongside Ignatius of Loyola. The right arm that had raised its hand to baptize more than 700,000 people was eventually removed and sent to Rome to the mother church of the Jesuits, where it remains, still incorrupt. En route to Rome, The ship carrying it was overtaken by a Dutch warship. The priest carrying the relic went to the deck and held the arm up toward the enemy ship in Xavier's name and told them to come no further. The enemy ship stopped. Sails full. Wind behind it. It simply stopped and did not move while the Portuguese vessel sailed away safely to Lisbon. The Dutch sailors stood on their deck and stared at an empty horizon, unable to account for what had happened. Even in his bones, Francis Xavier was still working. What does the life of Francis Xavier say to those of us alive in this century, watching our world slide deeper into spiritual darkness, looking at unreached billions with a mixture of guilt and helplessness and the quiet despair that asks whether one life can really matter? It says this: one life, fully surrendered to God, is more powerful than armies. Xavier was one man. He had no television, no internet, no airplane, no antibiotics, no financial support beyond what he could beg. He faced oceans that killed routinely, languages that took years to learn, cultures that regarded him with contempt or hostility, governments that actively obstructed him, and his own physical body that was pushed so far past its limits that by any reasonable medical standard he should have died several times before he actually did. And he converted over 700,000 people. He raised the dead. He stilled storms. He healed the sick with a touch. He dismantled the spiritual strongholds of entire kingdoms. He broke the power of the devil over populations that had been in darkness for generations. Not because he was exceptional. He was the first to insist he was not. He wrote to Ignatius from the middle of his greatest triumphs to say that what he felt most deeply was the awareness of his own sins and inadequacy, and that the visible fruit of his ministry was entirely the mercy of God using the most unworthy instrument available. He was exceptional in one thing only. He said yes. To God, to Ignatius in Paris, to the Pope in Rome, to Ignatius again when he was called to India, to every difficult assignment that came after that, yes. To poverty, to suffering, to obscurity in dying on an island where no one important would remember him, yes. To God's will in everything, every time, yes. The question posed to him in Paris by Ignatius, the question that broke through his pride and changed the trajectory of his life, the question he carried for the rest of his life as a weapon and a compass, is the same question that still hangs in the air over every human life on earth. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Francis Xavier chose the soul. His own, and then everyone else's he could reach. He spent himself entirely in the pursuit. He held nothing back. And God, who honors that kind of total surrender with a generosity that defies accounting, used one Spaniard born in a castle in Navarre to turn the spiritual map of the Eastern world inside out. The body of Francis Xavier still lies in Goa. Still incorrupt. Still a testimony to the fact that the God who called this is real, and that the power that moved through him is available still to anyone who is willing to say, with the same absolute sincerity that he said it on his knees in a chapel at Montmartre in 1534, "Here I am. Send me." If the story of Francis Xavier stirred something in your heart today, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was built for. We tell the stories of men and women who walked with God in ways that should make every one of us hunger for more, and there are so many more stories coming. Do us a simple favor right now, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you never miss another story from this channel. Every share plants a seed, and you never know whose life gets changed because you passed this along. And before you go, drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from. We love seeing just how far these stories are traveling, because just like Francis Xavier crossed oceans to carry the gospel, this community is spreading.